So I'm just going to read this out and then I'll explain obviously some of the work's being done in this space. So just to clarify, the new guidance from August, so only a couple of months old, from DfE states that where an apprentice has a learning difficulty or disability, regardless of whether they have been issued with an education, health and care plan or equivalent, which is a barrier to them achieving the English and maths requirements, providers should consider whether they should be offered the flexibility to achieve entry level 3 in functional skills in the adjusted subjects. Okay, so just to kind of explain where this guidance has come from. Historically, before August, generally you can make adjustments around maths and English, okay, for those individuals that had a current or historic education, health and care plan, okay, but it could only be for those individuals that obviously had the plan. Then what we had is a pilot that was done through DfE, of which Dynamic were part of that pilot, to look at actually that grey area, as I call it. What happens for the individuals that should have probably had a plan but didn't have a plan, that could go onto an apprenticeship pathway that would really benefit from those adjustments around maths and English? So the pilot happened, went on for probably about a year, Ollie, I believe it was, with really good success. And what we've got now is this new guidance that's coming from August to state that actually it should be opened up regardless of whether you've got an education, health and care plan or not, which is for me a game changer in this space. And what it really does is it really supports the identification of those individuals that could go onto an apprenticeship and allows for that conversation to be had to say whether they can be an adjustment around maths and English. So just a couple of things. When we talk about evidence, and evidence is a lot around making those exemptions. A lot of the evidence, and Ollie, you may want to come in on this, but generally that evidence can come from a GP. It can come from what we call neurodiverse assessment. And there's some really good organisations out there, such as Cognosist. I think Do It Profiler is another one, Ollie. But also it could come from an education psychologist or a Senko. Am I right in saying that, Ollie?
You are, yeah. It's and any other recognised assessment. However, it can't be a quick scan assessment, so it has to be a detailed recognised assessment.
Okay, so ultimately, this is, like I said, it's a bit of a game changer, and what we need to be doing is really driving this awareness, because there's a real lack of inconsistency around it. One of the other things I wanted to touch base on, which came from a bit of research or a webinar that I went to probably a couple of weeks back, is Labour's announcement, without trying to confuse you even more. But you may have heard that Labour are really looking into putting about £40 million into foundation apprenticeships. And foundation apprenticeships, it looks, and we're very kind of loose on the detail, as you could probably imagine, but we're looking at foundation apprenticeships coming in at level 1, level 2 to target some of those skill shortages. And I think the reason why Labour are really looking at that is, if you look at apprenticeships generally at the moment, there's about a 22% drop in apprenticeships in 16 to 18-year-olds completing apprenticeships. So there's a real lack of people coming through in that age category. And that's for 16 to 18-year-olds compared to just an 8% drop overall for other ages. So I think there's a bit of a kind of mic drop moment here, where we're not quite sure where foundation apprenticeships fit in, but they are coming. And I think ultimately it kind of feeds into this wider apprenticeship work around inclusivity. And I also think there's something here around, we know that 30% of the UK's workforce is going to be neurodivergent by 2030. So this conversation around inclusivity isn't going to go anywhere. Actually, we need to be getting ahead of the game and actually working with our training providers to be more inclusive, working with those employers and identifying those young people. Yes, Amy.
Sorry, I just missed that figure. What percentage did you say of the population would be neurodivergent by 2030? 30%.
Yes, that's the expectation.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, Ollie, can we move on, please?
Yeah, just to add to that, we've been using Cognisys as a neurodiversity tool for 4 years, and we've been showing for that period of time consistently 30% of our learners are showing as matching on Cognisys in 3 different areas, shown to be neurodiverse, and will need some sort of additional support or reasonable adjustments through their apprenticeship program. And our target audience is predominant. 90% of our learners are 23 plus existing members of staff within the health and care sector.
And I just think, based on what Ollie just mentioned there, I think that's the key bit. We're already noticing this through training providers now, through robust assessments, that actually a number of individuals are actually being identified. So it's a case that we actually need to get training providers into this space and allowing, what support is necessary for each learner, and very person-centered. So the aims and objectives for today. So we're looking at exploring the network of opportunities and stakeholders involved in apprenticeships within your local area, understanding your current local apprenticeship landscape, establishing a collective approach with education and other key stakeholders, recognising the alignment of apprenticeships, which I think is really key, of apprenticeships to other employment pathways, and then identifying some of the available funding that's out there that really helps both training providers and employers. So the next slide, please, Ollie. Okay, so we've got a bit of a visual here, but this slide is about ultimately all these clouds really are key stakeholders. Are key stakeholders that contribute to identifying inclusive talent. Okay, these are the people involved in our apprenticeship journey. I think in addition to these, okay, we've also got DfE that does a lot around policy and guidance. We've got the IFATE, which is the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education. We've got the Endpoint Assessment Organisation, the EPAO, and we've got the National Apprenticeship Site. But I just wanted to kind of just touch on a couple of these key stakeholders. So just to give you an idea, within Essex, we have 12,000 people within our SEND education system, 12,000, okay? That's not forgetting some of the individuals that are in our local authority divisional teams, which could be NEAT teams, it could be the leaving and aftercare teams, ex-offender teams, the mental health teams that could potentially come into this space. We've also got training providers. So ultimately, we've obviously got Dynamic on the call today as a very inclusive training provider, but some local authorities will have their own in-house training provider. How can we work with them if suitable to actually really drive that message around inclusivity with all those employers that they potentially work with? We've also got the other pathways. A lot of our apprenticeships generally come from sometimes our supported internship programs, but also we've got a huge supported employment offer within Essex County Council. And how can we upskill individuals that are in employment onto an apprenticeship, but also how can we allow those business connections that we've got with our supported employment, supported internship programs to actually then transition into this apprenticeship pathway. Where we've got others, that's generally where I've got A2W, shall I say, that's our access to work. So access to work can help with some support, whether it's travel or specific digital equipment. DWP and our levy transfer service, which is really key because the levy transfer service that we have can support some of those training costs that employers may have to take into account. Next slide, please, Ollie. Okay, within this slide, I really wanted to kind of almost showcase that driving apprenticeship awareness requires a bit of a kind of collaborative approach. So what we've got here, I've outlined almost some of the traditional parties that we think on the left-hand side, but also some of those innovative solutions in terms of where we can drive awareness through apprenticeships on the right-hand side. So I think it's really important that in the middle, those two key areas, vocational profiling and careers guidance, absolutely pivotal to the identification of individuals and to pathway planning, which is really key. But what I really wanted to do on this slide was really focus on the right-hand side about some of those drivers that we don't traditionally speak about as drivers, but can have a huge impact. So one of the first ones I want to discuss is parents. And sometimes we look at working with parents, but almost around kind of support and almost that conversation around, well, how best can we support the parent through education? But parents can create networks and support to drive through more accessible opportunities. They're so passionate about supporting their loved one that actually we should be utilising them more, because they all work for businesses and they all could actually promote or to drive those inclusive opportunities. So I think there's a really big space in regards to parents and carers to actually bring them into the conversation and work with them. And what I've noticed within the work we've done around apprenticeships, a number of our opportunities have been created by parents that have either gone out and really advocated on behalf of their son or daughter, or who have worked with the school to actually create those opportunities, or businesses coming into the school and working with the school. So I think parents and carers is a real key driver. Also, there's a big piece of work that we're doing around employers at the moment. And what we're trying to do is allowing businesses and education to be a bit closer and connect. So what we're looking at doing moving forward is to have both a work experience offering where businesses can connect with their local school, and it could be offering very much just to almost go to your local school and understand some of the talent within your local school. It could be a careers insight day. It could be offering a work experience, or it could be going into the school and actually driving that message around employability, CV support, interview support. And then, because if we don't have employers coming through at a very early stage and understanding the talent, that then we're going to struggle going to employers and promoting accessible apprenticeships where there's a cost. We need to bring the businesses into this inclusive space and allow businesses to connect, change their policies if need be, and allow for that connection to take place. So there's a huge amount of work that I think we can do around employers, bringing them in earlier in the piece, but also allowing them to come on that journey. And then I think we'll get more accessible apprenticeship opportunities that actually come as a result of that. Next slide, please, Ollie. Okay. One of the big things that we've been looking at within the local authority is just how many stakeholders that we have that can play a big part in the creation of opportunities and driving that inclusive message. So to give you a bit of an idea, within the local authority that I work for, we have a number of anchors, which could involve the NHS, the police, you've got fire and rescue, the local district councils, and education, which we often miss out in these conversations. But ultimately, the question we've got to them is, how can we support those anchors to actually create opportunities? How can we drive that message through them? They're all huge employers. So do we need to have an offer that goes out to them that is very simplistic, promotes the offering around accessible apprenticeships, and allows for the creation of those opportunities? You've got another of other key drivers in this space, supported employment, that we touched on earlier. And supported employment within our local authority work with about 12,000 businesses. Okay, if just 1% of those businesses wanted to then upskill people into accessible apprenticeship opportunities, that's a fantastic starting point. But again, it's about actually driving that message through our employers and what is our offer. We've also got the local skills improvement plan that I believe a number of councils will have up and down the country. And that's talking about how we identify some of these skill shortages and how do we address some of these skill shortages. So I think we need to take businesses on that journey, But again, how do we start that process? And a lot of it is around being very clear about what our expectations is and showcasing the talent that is available within this space that can actually fill some of those skill shortages. And lastly, but not least, I think is our social value, our corporate social responsibility as a local authority. And I think that's a key part. And what I generally notice is that a number of these huge organisations have contracts within the local councils, and they also have metrics around promoting apprenticeships and promoting opportunities for individuals with a disability or a difficulty. My question is, how do we best work with those organisations? Because those businesses want to come into this inclusive space, the council wants them to come into this inclusive space, but how do we work with them to support the creation of those opportunities? So I think this slide just gives you a general thought process of actually who's involved, and actually there's a number of stakeholders there which should be driving that message, but we need to make sure we understand what that message looks like. Okay, next slide, Ollie. Okay, so I just wanted to touch on understanding your current local apprenticeship landscape in regards to training providers. So there's a number of local training providers within Essex. We've got Essex Provider Network, but I'm aware of other training provider networks, such as the Northern Skills Network, Greater Manchester Network, Western Provider Network, and even Devon and Cornwall Training Provider Network. There's a number of what I call provider networks up and down the country that we can feed into. So I think the main question really is that from a local authority perspective is, are we linking in with our provider networks, and how are we driving that message around inclusivity, that guidance, and how we're supporting those training providers to be further inclusive in this space. So when we talk about training providers, what I would like to see, and Ollie's aware of some of my expectations, but the conversation I have with a lot of parents is that, okay, John, you talk a lot about accessibility within apprenticeships, but I go to the training providers, but generally, where is it on their website? Where are some of the adjustments? What does this look like for my son or daughter? And what are some of the exemptions that they can have? Okay, so I think there's a lot around actually how we promote this through our training providers and through our provider networks. And also, what does that onboarding look like? What does the delivery model look like for a young person with SEND? What is the learning support? What does that look like? And we talked in workshop 1 about additional learner support and exceptional learner support that actually can be drawn down as funding from a training provider, and some of those program adjustments. And what I mean is that when we talk about adjustments, generally what we do is a lot of our young people will need an adjustment in terms of that delivery program. Okay, putting 10 young people together doesn't always work. It might need to be very person-centered for that individual, and that comes from an understanding of the individual. So a lot of the work we do within a local authority is to help upskill some of those training providers in terms of the young person, their disability or a difficulty, and maybe some of the adjustments that might need to be under consideration. So I think whenever you speak to a training provider, I would ask some of those questions around, are you used to working with people with a disability or difficulty? Is your delivery virtual, or is it face-to-face? You know, some of these questions that will really get you understanding a little bit around how that training provider delivers for our, what I call vulnerable characteristic groups. Lastly, just on this slide, Ollie, just what I wanted to mention is a big piece of work that I'm looking at the moment is around empowerment passports. I don't know whether you may have heard, but empowerment passports, what I would really like to happen is when young people come through to a training provider, I think it's really important that a young person has a suite of documents that actually can promote not only their disability or difficulty, but some of the actual non-negotiables that a training provider may need in terms of evidence. So things like a copy of an education, health and care plan would be really good as part of their empowerment passport. Maths and English certifications, so that actually the training provider has that documentation. An adjustment passport, which is a bit of an understanding of their needs and some of the adjustments that may need to be put into place for that individual. Identification that the training provider will need, passport, birth certificate, etc. Maybe some access to work paperwork, which will support in terms of maybe things like getting to and from work, and maybe a copy of your CV. And I think this is a piece of work that I'm really keen to put together, because what it will do is it will allow for that conversation to happen with a training provider, who then, as part of onboarding, will have everything that they potentially need to be able to put in those exemptions or adjustments. So I think that's a piece of work that I really want to kind of move forward. But again, it will make training providers come into that inclusive space, I hope. Next slide, Ollie. Okay, so I just want to talk a little bit about local authorities and leading by example. So a couple of points here. Create a clear apprenticeship strategy. And when I've got here, I've got an AA pot to support recruitment. What I'm noticing within the local authority is that I think there needs to be a pot of money put aside to support the drive for inclusivity around apprenticeships. So for hiring managers who want to recruit inclusively, but also want, because what we've got at the moment, we've got almost this conversation around mainstream recruitment versus inclusive talent, and businesses are very, very wary. But what we need, I think, within the council is a pot of money that actually allows divisional recruitment to be quite inclusive. So it's something I'm a massive advocate of within my own local authority, but it's definitely something that allows that drive and allows managers to kind of come into this space at their own kind of at their own point. Also, embed accessible apprenticeships into an early career pathway. So one of the things that I did when we started, promoting accessible apprenticeships was actually I wanted it embedded as a pathway, so people could see when they were coming to Essex County Council that actually accessible apprenticeships was a pathway into the council. That's something that's still evolving, but the fact that we've got it embedded is really testament to some of the work we've done in that space. Also, I think we know how valuable apprenticeships is as a pathway into employment, but also promoting that through to SLT, which is our senior leadership teams, is absolutely crucial. And it is a cost-effective pathway. It's about matching talent to aspirations. A little bit around developing a clear career progression planning. And I think this is really key from a local council perspective. What I'm seeing is that we're promoting apprenticeships, which is fantastic, and we're getting people onto accessible apprenticeships, but we also need to have a transition. If you look at what happens externally, about 93% go on to apprenticeship, go on to paid employment at the end of apprenticeship. Within the local council, I think there's a little bit of work to do on that, but actually that should be part of the planning. It shouldn't be standalone apprenticeships, and then we're looking at what's next. It should be apprenticeships with a view to actually retaining that talent that we've worked so hard to develop. Contribute to local economy. We know about whilst reducing skills gaps, increasing social mobility and fostering growth. We know in terms of the number of individuals that are very talented. We know that we've got an economy that's struggling to recruit in terms of certain areas. So actually this is in keeping with our strategic approach as a council, and actually this is about fostering economic growth. And then shout about it. I think that as much as we promote accessible apprenticeships, I think there's some a lot more work that can be done about really shouting about it as a local council, case studies, promoting this, not just with our stakeholders, but within our education system, that this is a valuable pathway moving forward. Okay, next slide, Ollie. Okay, so this slide was a bit of a brain dump. Welcome to the mind of John. But what I wanted to try to get across today is that a little bit about the labour market and how a local authority can really support some of the what I call variables when people go on to apprenticeships. So the example here that I've put together is really a young person that actually is looking to go on to an apprenticeship. In their labour market or their local labour market, health and social care, retail, motor vehicle and education were the kind of main skills area within the local economy. But that individual's aspiration is IT. But then what happens is what we need to do as a local authority is be flexible to that aspiration, but also make sure that we have the right structure of support that actually can support that individual's aspiration. So we mentioned travel training, and travel training is a good example. I'm a massive advocate of travel training being embedded within our education system, especially if they're moving into apprenticeships. But we also have supporting services that can actually help with that. Are parents aware of that? It could be access to work. It could be the King's Trust development grant, used to be the Prince's Trust, and that's £150. Could that help with getting people to and from work, whether it's a train ticket or whether it's upfront financial support to allow them to get to work? I also think there's something here around financial, and obviously there are some families out there with a low income that we need to be very, very considerate of. And the DWP have some financial support around that can actually help some of those low income families. We also have digital, and a lot of our guys are again around digital poverty. We have a digital team within Essex that can support with things like digital poverty. We can support with digital equipment, some training around digital awareness. So I think this slide is really to show just a number of variables that as a local authority, how can we support those young people or this young person to move into their area of aspiration, which in this case is outside of its stereotypical labour market. So I think it's just a consideration that when we're trying to push through accessible apprenticeships, there are a number of variables that we need to really make sure that we've got structure of support that can actually generally come from the local authority. Okay, next slide, Ollie. Okay, so this whole workshop's been generally about having this collaborative approach and people working together. So I just want to give you an example of Tom's case study. Okay, Tom was a young person that came through when an employer made contact with me and said, I'm really interested in taking potentially Tom as an apprentice. Okay, he'd been doing his work experience. He was fantastic, very empathetic. He did a lot of work in regards to individuals with a disability or a difficulty. But Tom's aspiration was very much around sport. Okay, and he loved working with young people around sport and coaching, etc. So in terms of partnership working, we worked with a huge number of people that were involved in Tom's kind of support network. And that ranged from social care. Tom had a social worker, his SEND careers advisor, his family, but his aspiration was very much to go on to an apprenticeship under the community activator, which is a sports coach level 2. To set this up, we worked very closely with a training provider who drew down the additional learner support to support some of those adjustments that Tom would need on his apprenticeship. We also worked very closely with our Access to Work colleagues who allowed Tom to get to and from work. Tom is epileptic, so he had a number of challenges in that space about getting to and from work. But what we didn't want to do is see it as a barrier to him. So what he ended up having was a support worker that went in the taxis to and from work, but also Access to Work pay for not only the support worker, but for his taxis to allow him to get to and from work. And I think the moral of this story really is that the reason there needs to be a lead for accessible apprenticeships within the local council is you are that kind of conduit. You are that person that actually can bring this together. And the amount of people that were involved just in Tom's case study was a huge number of people. But what it did do is it allowed an individual that generally was told throughout his career that he couldn't go into employment because of his epilepsy. Actually, that was nonsense. He could. It just needed that kind of joined up approach. And the last thing is, as part of Tom's transition, now that he's in employment, because the business took him on, he has now supported employment that just generally keeps an eye on Tom and just reaches out in terms of that support if he needs it. But Tom's journey has been a really successful one. And now, as I say, he's a fully fledged member of staff who's doing what he wants to do in his career. Next slide, please, Ollie. Okay, I'm going to have a bit of a break because this room is getting warmer. But Ollie, can you just share Imogen's story, and then I'll explain a little bit about Imogen's story after, if that's all right.
Just fine. Can you just give us a thumbs up? You can hear the sound.
Yeah, no problem.
Imogen has global developmental delay, dyspraxia and ASD autism traits. Yeah, and she was diagnosed with those when she was around 8-9 years old. In her own environment, she appears more comfortable, more settled. Take her out of that environment and you get a very glazed look, not understanding the world really as we do. She hasn't completed yet, but she's coming to the end of her level 2 City and Guilds in child development. But this has allowed her to have a work placement within a nursery that she loves working with children, and we have seen a different Imogen working within the environment of childcare.
Imogen started with us as a volunteer and then progressed into an apprenticeship. We got to notice that she needed a bit of extra time when kind of asking her to do something. So we couldn't just say to her this in the morning, you've got to do this today, Imogen, and you can't kind of throw things at her. You need to give her a bit of time to kind of take the information in. The girls in the room, they all know her really well, and they're able to kind of cope with that slight change quite easily. It's not a problem at all.
Is it a red tomato? Is it good girl, baby boo?
She's a very valued member of staff. The children absolutely love her, and Imogen has found that working with children is something that she absolutely loves. With new people coming through looking for jobs, you don't always find that. You don't find that person that's here because they really, really want to. 9 times out of 10, especially with apprentices, they're here because their parents told them they've got to go out and they've got to get a job, and you know, they do learn to love childcare, but Imogen has loved it from the off. Having that from her was really lovely, and now we can build upon the communication side of everything and support her where she needs that support.
Okay, thanks, Ollie, for sharing that. So just to touch on Imogen, really is got a bit of a soft spot for Imogen because she was my first accessible apprentice. But her story, she's completed her early years level 2 qualification now. She's employed by the business. And more importantly, I think that video really shows about matching talent to business. And she is absolutely fantastic in terms of what she does, and she's a testament to the industry she works in. And some of the work we did with a business was very much around her adjustment passport, which was just sharing with the business a little bit of an understanding about Imogen and some of her challenges, but also promoting some of, you know, the fantastic attributes she's got to work in that sector. And then we did a bit of work with Imogen around access to work in terms of her getting to and from work. From her development, she no longer uses access to work now. She drives independently. So not only is she in paid work, but she also drives to and from work. So the development of that individual is absolutely fantastic to see. And I think it gives everyone a bit of motivation to what can be done in this space. Okay, I'm going to touch on the next couple of slides because I'm sure there's a few questions at the end. I think this slide really, what I wanted to do is just showcase just some of the pathways that actually can lead into accessible apprenticeships. Generally, we talk, I know, around supported internships, and there's a lot of value in that. And we also talk around supported employment. But a lot of the actual pathways that work very well for us is around that work experience. Leads back to my first slide about bringing business and education a little bit closer together. We've had people that have come from volunteering, and we've also had people that have been in paid employment where the business has said, how can we upskill? So I think this really is just a crazy visual, just to get you thinking about actually apprenticeships can come from a variety of different pathways. Okay, next slide. You'll be pleased that this is the last slide. So I just want to touch on in terms of some of the available funding, and this will be dependent on local authorities, but I think it's really important when you start breaking down what funding is available. I think it's actually probably more than what we think to start with. So just to give you an idea, if we go under each category, under the apprentice, we've got the flexible support fund. And I found this out through a conversation with DWP. And I used it really effectively for those families that were maybe on a low income that actually utilised access to work. But we know with access to work, you have to pay out to receive, and some of the families don't have the capability to pay out. So the flexible support fund, which you don't have to pay back, can act as that kind of interim that allows that individual to go out to work. So I think the flexible support fund, bit of a hidden secret, but it really can support. We know in terms of the King's Trust Development Grant, we talked about that a little bit earlier, but also there's some funding there for care leavers, which I think there's a bit more work to do in the space around care leavers, but it's out there that can really support, obviously, employers to take on potential care leavers. In terms of the employer, the £1,000 incentives for those 16 to 18 are up to 25, I believe, with an education, health and care plan. You've also got, in terms of some of the specific funding around some of the different industries. So to give an example, I think I use CITB. So if you're a business that is registered, if you're an employer that's registered with a CITB, you could potentially get £1,000 if a young person has an education, health and care plan. You could have levy transfer service that can pay for that, some of those training costs, but also there's £2,500 attendance bonus for the employer. And there's also a £3,500 on successful achievement of the qualification. So you're talking there just over £7,000 with the levy transfer that a business would not be aware of. So I think there's a lot of work we can do around when we identify businesses, what actual support is there for that business, because that conversation is a bit of a game changer if I'm going in with some of the support, that financial support that is available for a business. And then the last thing is around a training provider. So the training provider also get £1,000 incentive to take on someone with an education, health and care plan. Also the training provider, there's learning support, which we talked about earlier, additional learner support funding, which is £150 per calendar month. Exceptional learner support training, which is for those more complex individuals. but also there's levy transfer as well, which we spoke about as well. Additionally, there's also something that we've got within Essex, which is a £2,000 incentive for employers that can help in terms of increasing wages. We know the apprenticeship wage is going to increase to £7.55 next April, and £10 for those that I believe are 18 to 20. But actually, that £2,000 can either be used for travel support, which would be really beneficial for the individual, or it can be used to slightly supporting businesses to increase that apprenticeship wage if possible. So I just wanted to just give you a bit of an insight. There's a number of pockets of funding, and every local authority will be different, but it paints a slightly more positive picture that actually will support some of that engagement, especially with businesses.